Most of us look at Kwame Nkrumah and we see this legendary figure who did so much for Ghana, of course, and he is almost always remembered as a great leader. May his soul rest in peace. He had this reputation for being very sharp, and he was the type of leader who was always watching out for the country's interest. But then there is this one part of his story that is actually strange, and for the most part, it's a detail that stays hidden from the public. One day, a man managed to walk right into the Flagstaff house and scammed the president under his nose. And today, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened and how it happened. So make sure you stay with me until the very end. And please give this video a like if you can. And by the way, the remaining part of this story is going to be a podcast, so you can listen to it on the background and subscribe to the channel. In 1962, a Romanian-born businessman named Noe Drevici arrived in Accra, and this guy went straight to the Flagstaff house. I mean, he didn't follow any of the usual security protocols that the government normally requires for visitors. Instead, this guy wanted a meeting with the president straight away. To make sure he got that meeting, he introduced himself as a major investor in the European chocolate industry. He knew that that kind of status would get the president attention. And boy, he was right. Kwame Nkrumah was so excited to have a big shot like that come to Ghana. So he immediately welcomed him and decided to bypass the regular background checks. And this move allowed Drevici to sit down and start negotiating directly with the president of Ghana without anyone ever looking into his history. And once he had established that connection, Drevici took his ideas to the chief economic consultant at the time. He pitched a very sweet plan to build factories all across the country that would take raw cocoa beans and process them into finished products like chocolate and cocoa butter. Before Drevici would arrive, I don't know how he did this, but he was well aware that Ghana was short on cash. So he told the government that they wouldn't have to provide any cash upfront to get the project started. He promised to begin building the factories immediately and then simply push the actual payment years into the future by adding them to the national debt. To make this work, he asked Nkrumah to sign a promise to cover all the costs so that he wouldn't back out later. Then Drevici told them that his own companies would manage all the financing and construction work, so the country wouldn't need to use any of its current funds now. And also, to make sure that he doesn't get suspicious, he set up the Drevici Group. In reality, this was just a network of empty fake companies that he registered in Lugano and Panama so that all the money could stay completely hidden outside the country. And once these companies were ready, he personally drafted the contracts for the Temakoko processing plant and arranged everything so that his own companies were responsible for the designing, the funding, and then the building of the entire thing. This actually gave him total control over every single part of the project. He even went as far as secretly removing the rules from the contract that would have allowed outside inspectors to come in and check on the work. After he had everything set up to his advantage, this guy handed the paperwork directly to Nkrumah. And because the document had lots of papers, the president failed to notice that buried deep inside one of those contracts, Drevici had slipped in a very dangerous rule to his own advantage. It stated that the government was required to pay him 20% of the total project money in advance, and this had to happen before his workers even started digging at the site. Nkrumah was so caught up in the excitement of Ghana finally producing its own chocolate that he completely ignored the standard checks and he signed the contract without ever asking Drevici to prove if he actually had the skill or the resources to do the work. Once the papers were signed, the president ordered the Bank of Ghana to push the notes to Drevici, and the bankers followed those orders. They handed over millions of pounds in government notes directly to this guy, which basically trapped the country in a massive amount of debt at the time. And as soon as Drevici had those official government papers in his hands, this guy caught a flight to Europe and went straight to meet with all the bosses at various foreign banks. He showed those bankers the notes signed by the president of Ghana and made a huge show of how an entire nation was standing behind it with promises of massive future interest, which was exactly how he convinced the banks to pay to buy the papers from him for actual cash. He spent time negotiating the exchange rates with them, and eventually those European banks accepted the government guarantees and finalized the trades. This meant that he walked away with millions of pounds in cash, successfully turning his empty promises in Ghana into a personal fortune. And he didn't keep that money where anyone could see it. Instead, he sent it all straight into his secret bank accounts in Lugano and Panama. To make it look like he was actually making progress on the work in Ghana, he visited all the scrap yards in Europe and then he bought a massive amount of old broken down factory equipment. He had all that useless metal shipped down to the construction site in Tema and gave orders to his workers to arrange the machines all around the new concrete foundations. Now my problem is, how could someone even ship all these useless metals into the country and it hadn't been spotted? To the extent that this was supposed to be for the Tema cocoa processing plant and still nobody had to check it. Like the whole setup was designed to make the place look like it was a busy and productive work zone, which helped him hide the reality that no real building was actually happening. Using this fake display as his proof, Drevici started handing over bills to the government, claiming that he had just delivered brand new state-of-the-art factory. Sorry. So, where were we? So he actually claimed. So sorry. Whew. This is just ridiculous. So he claimed that he had just delivered brand new state-of-the-art factory technology. Like the workers at the National Treasury, they processed the payment and they paid those bills because the paperwork matched the signed fund. God, Randy, Bobby. Okay, so he then took all that fresh money and funneled it right into his own private account. After Drevici managed to get that first round of cash into his hands, he changed the way he did the business. From that point on, he made sure that he only negotiated with the president directly for the rest of the project. He did this on purpose because he wanted to cut out all the regular government staff and the financial inspectors, which meant there was nobody around to actually look at what he was doing or check his account. This was a perfect setup for him, and it allowed him to keep draining the money out of the national accounts while those old broken machines he had brought in just sat there and started rusting away. So fast forward to 1964, Kwame Nkrumah officially launched what he called the 7-year development plan. This was a huge national project designed to put a large amount of state funding into building up the country's infrastructure. Drevici looked at this new plan And this guy saw it as a perfect chance to get his hands on even more of those funds. He immediately started drafting fresh proposals and arranging meetings directly with the president so he could secure the money before any other contractors even had a chance to bid on it. He went straight to the executive branch and laid out two strong ideas. And one of them was the Temakoko silos, and then the other was something he called the interlocking food complex. He told Nkrumah that if Ghana could store its entire national crop in these new facilities, the country would finally be in a position to tell the rest of the world what the price of cocoa should be. Drevici set the price for the silo project alone at £4 million, and then he put a lot of pressure on the administration to agree to his terms. The previous project hadn't even been started, but Kwame Nkrumah absolutely loved the vision and he bought into the idea right away. So he signed a new contract on the spot without even asking a single person to review the details first. And because these new projects were given the green light, the total amount of money that the country owed to Drevici Group, including the Temakoko processing project, jumped all the way to £70 million. Once he had all those final signatures in his hand, Drevici took the paperwork and left so he could start the process of collecting his payment. He asked his workers to put together some basic designs for a group of tall concrete storage towers that were supposed to sit along the coast, and then they sent those plans to the government officials. The engineers who drew those plans didn't really care about the best way to keep the cocoa beans safe or fresh. They just designed something that the crew could build as quickly as possible, just to hit the specific construction milestones that will trigger that secret advance payment rules that Drevici had hidden in the original contracts. So the government gave the go-ahead on those plans. So the crews went straight to the site and they started working day and night, to get those towers built as fast as they could. They would finish a section of the construction, then, they'll take progress photos beautifully and they'll send them to the government for money. Meanwhile, the old scrap machines he had brought in earlier, they just sat there on the site and they started rusting away. It was like everybody had forgotten about the previous project. And to save himself even more money, he told his workers to only build the exterior walls of the tower. And this meant that while they looked like a finished building from a distance, the inside of the buildings was actually hollow and completely empty. But while those useless towers were being built, a government employee named Emmanuel found that something was very wrong with the money in the country's treasury. He spent a lot of time looking through the books and realized that a massive amount of money was leaving the country without any reason. So he started digging into the state accounts to see if he could figure out what was really happening behind the scenes. He worked alongside some officials from the Bank of Ghana to put together detailed reports. These documents proved that the debts tied to Drevici's contracts were basically draining the national treasury until there was nothing left. They knew the country was about to run out of money, so they decided to bypass their regular bosses. They took the ledgers straight to the president to show him the evidence. In fact, the meeting was very tense. Emmanuel laid all the paperwork out in front of Nkrumah and pointed to the exact amount of debt that Drevici now had his hands on. He warned the president that the economy was not going to survive if they kept making these payments. He even asked him to freeze the funds immediately so they could conduct like a real investigation into Drevici's business. But Nkrumah wouldn't hear a word of what they were saying. He was very furious. This guy was boiling up. So he ended up throwing them out of his office for daring to suggest an investigation on his favorite boy, Drevici. But he didn't stop there. To punish them for speaking up, he signed an order that gave Drevici full legal protection. This was a huge blow because it officially stopped the bank and the financial workers from ever checking on Drevici's finances or his building site again. But even with the new restrictions, a group of independent farmers, they managed to sneak into the sites, and they walked inside those towers so they could test the air and see if the conditions were actually right for keeping raw crops safe and fresh. After they finished their inspection, these experts wrote up a very critical report. They showed that the towers didn't have any of the necessary machinery to dry the air or to circulate it. Without those machines, the towers were completely useless for their intended purpose of storing cocoa. These experts warned the government very clearly that the buildings were a total failure and wouldn't work at all. They also explained that if anyone actually tried to pour raw cocoa beans into those useless sealed concrete towers, the entire crop would start to rot in just a matter of days. The rotting was not even the worst part. They said that the worst part was that the beans would likely get so hot that they would catch fire in those buildings. Even with that terrifying information, the government didn't take any action at all. They just threw those warnings away and let the builder continue his work because he had the president's protection. Drevici was well aware that the state was turning a blind eye to everything he was doing, so this guy didn't even bother fixing any of those fatal design flaws. He just kept right on with the construction, and he sent bill after bill to the National Treasury, and the state just kept cutting him checks without asking a single question about the quality of the work. It's just so ridiculous. And as long as he could show that those empty concrete shells were getting taller, he was legally able to pull the very last bit of money out of the dying treasury. Eventually, his workers finished up the tops of the towers. They packed all their gear and they just walked away, leaving those useless buildings standing there on the coast. Drevici managed to get his final cash payouts for the year right at the same time the country's economy began to fall apart. In late 1965, the price of cocoa on the global market crashed. So that essentially wiped out the main source of income for the entire nation. Within just a few weeks, the country's cash reserves completely dried up. This forced the government to step in and, put in strict limits on how much food, how much fuel and basic supplies that regular people were allowed to buy at their local markets. It wasn't long before the store shelves were totally empty. Ordinary citizens were forced to stand in these long queues for hours, just to get simple food to buy. But there was no food or money to be found. So because of this, there was serious protest that started breaking out all over the country. Massive crowds of people filled the streets. They kept throwing things at government buildings. They were getting into violent fights with the police. These riots were so bad that the whole political system started to break down, leaving the ruling government extremely weak and causing them to lose their grip on the capital. And since the treasury was running out of money, the state eventually reached a point where it couldn't even pay for its basic daily operations. Drevici could see that the government was failing to pay its bills, so he packed his bags and then he headed to Europe. He took his last stack of government payment papers with him, hoping to sell them off before everything collapsed. He walked right into the foreign banks and spoke directly with the managing directors there. He told them he was willing to take a penalty cut on his returns just to get the money immediately. He signed the agreement to force the deals through as fast as he could before the country went totally broke and the papers became worthless. And even after taking those penalty cuts, he walked out of those banks with £9 million in untraceable cash. The moment Drevici had that money, he went straight to the wire tellers and filled out the paperwork to move the funds out of the open market. He was in a hurry because he wanted to get the cash away before anyone had a chance to track the trades or see where the money was going. He moved that wealth across international borders and he put it directly into his secret accounts in Lugano and Panama. And by doing this, he was able to lock all that stolen money behind foreign privacy laws, which meant the government in Ghana wouldn't be able to reach a single cent of that money. After he had secured his fortune, This guy, with all his courage, he traveled back to Accra to find chances of getting more money from the president. But Nkrumah decided to leave the country and fly to Hanoi for a state peace trip at the time. He took a motorcade through the city to get to the airport. He boarded his plane, leaving the failing government behind to deal with the ongoing financial crisis without him. But this departure was a major turning point in the story because there was already a coup that was being planned against Nkrumah in secret. And since he was leaving the country, it was the perfect opportunity. And according to some sources, that peacekeeping trip was like a carefully calculated lie used to trick the president to go out of the country so they could take over. But the president also fell for it. The army and the police, they were watching closely as he flew out of the country, and they immediately launched Operation Cold Chop. The soldiers moved straight into the capital. They were driving their trucks right up to the gates of the main government buildings. They quickly overpowered the guards, used force to take permanent control of the facilities. And one by one, they arrested the officials who were still on the premises and brought a sudden end to the old political system without the president's knowledge. This move completely destroyed the special protection that Drevici had built for himself. With the old government gone, the military leaders stepped in and formed the National Liberation Council to take total control of the state. Drevici saw this military takeover happening and he realized that he was in serious trouble. This guy has done a very big mistake. He knew that coming back to Ghana was a very big mistake, so he decided to leave his mansions and expensive cars in Accra. He didn't even try to pack much. He just grabbed whatever that he could fit into a few bags and used the total chaos of the coup to escape the city. He left behind those useless, unfinished buildings in Tema and fled across the border, completely vanishing from the country. The new military leaders started looking at the national debt he had left behind and that Nkrumah had left behind, and they decided that the missing contractor was going to be their main target. So they sent armed soldiers straight to his company offices in Accra, where the troops broke through the front doors and kicked every single staff member out of the building. The military locked down his entire office and made sure to grab every single paper record before anyone had a chance to destroy the evidence. The soldiers also took over all of his properties and they went straight to the local banks to freeze every account that was tied to his business. To really get to the bottom of everything that had happened, the military leaders set up there's something they call the Apalu Commission or something like that, and they ordered them to dig into every state contract and financial guarantee connected to Drevici. They dug through all the paperwork to try and track down exactly where the stolen funds had gone. They even went to the Central Bank of Ghana and seized all the old transaction books that had anything to do with the Tema project. So they carried all those heavy ledgers back to their office so they could study them in detail. As the auditors traced those papers, they found out that the president had pushed all those deals through without any of the usual checks and balances. As we know, he had completely skipped the standard contract committees that were supposed to review these things before any signatures were ever put on paper. It was very clear from the dates that he had been given the money before any actual work had even started. So the auditors were finally able to prove that Noe Drevici had wired that last £9 million out of the local economy. They tracked the specific bank codes step by step, and those codes pointed directly to his secret accounts in Lugano and Panama, which allowed the team to map out exactly where the cash had flown. And once they had all that stolen money documented, the military leaders sent a team of state engineers out to the site in Tema. They gave the engineering team orders to take their tools, inspect the abandoned facilities, and report back on everything they found inside. When the engineers walked through those buildings, they confirmed that the brand new processing equipment Drevici had promised was nowhere to be found. Instead of high-tech machinery, they just found some piles of old, rusted, useless scrap metal sitting on the floors. They pulled out the blueprints and compared them to the actual construction, only to find that critical parts of the machines were missing entirely. They also pointed out that the windowless design of the towers was a total disaster because it would trap heat and moisture inside, which would have destroyed any crops stored there. And this proved that the entire project was a carefully built fake from the start. The members of the Apollo Commission took all of those reports and they combined them all together with the records of the financial fraud and handed them directly to the leaders of the military council, who now had all the undeniable proof they needed to see the fraud for what it was. Once they had that evidence, the military leaders officially cancelled every single one of Drevici's contracts and struck his name off the state vendor list for good. They made a huge public announcement that they were throwing out the £70 million national debt tied to his company, which sent a very clear message to the international banking community. They told everyone that the country was simply refusing to pay back any of the money connected to those corrupt papers. The foreign banks that had originally bought those useless papers were not happy with the news at all, and they reacted by filing lawsuits against Ghana in several different European countries. They were demanding that the state guarantees be paid back in full regardless of what had happened. They didn't really care about that. All they know is that we have the papers, you have to pay. And in response, the leaders in Ghana hired a specialized team of lawyers and gave them the full briefing on all the evidence they had uncovered. They sent those lawyers straight to Europe to fight the claims. The Ghanaian legal team, they sat down with the foreign bankers and placed the building reports and the corrupt financial books right on the table in front of them, proving to the bankers that the plans were a complete scam from the start. Faced with that kind of evidence, the European banks had no choice but to sit down and try to negotiate a deal. Like the banks eventually gave in and signed a secret agreement to drop a large part of their claims against the country. So they ended up taking the financial hit themselves, restructuring their terms and finally wiping that £70 million debt off the official Ghanaian record for good. It was a massive win for the new government though. And even after all those negotiations were finally finished, that last £9 million remained completely out of reach. It stayed locked up tight inside those foreign bank accounts, and there was simply no way the Ghanaian government could get their hands on it anymore. And once everyone involved realized the money was gone for good, both the banks and Ghana, the two sides came together to sign the final set of papers. And this brought the entire legal case to a definitive end, and the whole matter was officially closed. And this was how Kwame Nkrumah, the Almighty, the wonderful leader, the visionary Africanist, this is how he was scammed. If this is the first time you are hearing this story, I have a lot of stories that you have not heard. Trust me, I have a lot of them and you would love to listen to them. So please subscribe to my channel, like this video. My name is Nix. You can call me Nix World. And this is Mysteries with Nix. See you in the next video.